looks like everyone's ready. And the timer? All right, please start the time. So, this is pretty awkward. Awkward? Yeah, just a little bit awkward. Well, what would be awkward about me just standing here for a couple of seconds, not saying anything? Yeah, see, there I go again, making things awkward. We live in a really noisy world. We drive home from work with the radio on, and then as soon as we're home, the TV's on in the background, and conversations are constant and so full of words that whenever you meet someone new and there's no small talk, and there's that awkward silence, well, things are just awkward. Well, why is that? How come silence a couple of seconds ago or in that situation is awkward, but then silence at home at the end of a long day is relaxing? How come the quiet makes some people feel calm and some people feel uneasy? What is silence? Well, to answer that question, one must simply look at what role silence is playing in different aspects of life. After looking at what the role silence is playing in psychology, in culture, and lastly in our own lives, we can see that though a vague concept, silence actually has the potential to be a powerful tool in teaching us about how we communicate and who we actually are. There's more to it than meets the eye, or should I say ear. There's this man named Gordon Hempton, and he's designated a section of Olympic National Park in Washington State as what he calls one square of silence. He's declared it to be the most quiet place in the entire United States. He's an acoustic ecologist, which means he finds his career in recording sounds. And his book he wrote, discussing his journey to make this square of silence, he talks about his life mission of finding the quietest places in the entire world. Not to rid life of any sound whatsoever, but simply to return again to that calming surrounding of natural sound. So, of course, this square of silence is going to have trees and wind and the normal sounds of nature. Which begs the question, how can this be compared to absolute silence in an entirely different situation, such as that as solitary confinement, for instance? In the fall of 1982, forensic psychiatrist Stuart Gracian visited the Walpole State Center and interviewed a dozen or so men who had been locked in solitary confinement for months on end. He found that most of them reported symptoms of stupor, delirium, hallucinations, a lack of perceptual constancy, which is basically the ability to tell the sameness of things when viewed from different distances and angles. Well, both of these situations are technically rooted in silence, so what makes them so different? Well, psychologist Craig Haney said on the effects of solitary confinement that so much of who we are is dependent on our interactions with other people, that social context in which we function, that we tend to identify ourselves based on how we communicate with other people, that when you remove someone from that, they begin to lose their very sense of self. Meanwhile, in nature, psychologists are using something called the attentive restoration theory to determine that when you're in a situation that doesn't require your brain to truly respond to anything, you become naturally calmer. So it can be theorized, comparing these two studies, that the way that our brains react to silence on the psychological level is dependent on the context. In a situation such as solitary confinement, silence becomes a symbol of uncertainty, of loneliness, of fear. But then in a situation that requires nothing from us, it begins to represent a mental calm. But psychology is just one side of it. What about the other half of the question? What about actual people themselves and how they respond to silence differently? Well, the other angle to look at this is, what role does silence play in culture? Anthropologist Edward Hall broke cultures up into two different kinds, perfectly differentiating how different cultures respond to silence. He broke them up into two types: high context and low context cultures. High context cultures love communication. Conversations are held very structurally, one person talking after the other. They rely on that implicit communication and those nonverbal cues. Silence in a conversation simply means respect. That person is thinking through through what you have said to make sure that their response meets its merits. Examples of these cultures are cultures from Africa, Latin America, or Asian regions. They are also called just simply listening cultures. Low context culture, on the other hand, they love communication, but in a way that means they use it constantly. American culture is an example of this. We love to talk. And small talk, though generally hated, is seen as necessary to avoid the dreaded awkward silence. To illustrate this, picture yourself driving home from work or from school, and there's a bunch of classmates and coworkers in the back of the car, and the radio is off, and no one is saying anything. If that thought made you cringe just a little bit, there's a good thought that you've become adjusted to that consistently low context culture that is the United States. We don't tend to like silence. But what is that rooted in? Well, a study of 560 undergraduate students undertaken over 6 years by Bruce Fell determined that constant exposure to background media and sound has made a generation of students and people who are afraid of silence. Fear. Like that person in solitary confinement, afraid of the silence, or perhaps afraid of sounds becoming overstimulating. Like a person from a low context culture talking to someone from a high context culture, afraid because silence means something different to them. Like a socially anxious person, afraid because they think silence in a conversation means they did something wrong. Fear. Are we afraid of silence? And for those who prefer silence over sound, is it because it has become an escape from the noise of the world? Are we afraid of silence, or are we afraid of noise? And I think asking ourselves what silence we prefer, in which situations we love it, will teach us a lot about ourselves. Do we love silence at home because it means that calm at the end of a long day? Or do we hate it at home because it means there's no one else there? Psychology and cultural analysis aside, what about our lives? What role does silence play in our lives, and what role can it play in our lives? Well, think about the concept. Think about silence, and how does that make you feel? Indifferent? Calm? Awkward? Shy? Elated? Relaxed? No matter what it is rooted in that noise. We either turn to silence to escape from it, or we turn to noise because it has become a comfort. I'm an introvert, which means I don't get my energy from people. But at the same time, whenever I'm alone, I hate the silence. It's why the first thing I do when I'm home alone is I turn on music. Because without that noise, then I start to think. And when I start to think too much, I get antsy, and I get nervous, and breathing gets harder. So I fill my life with noise. I fill my life with activities and socializing and sounds, because the busier I keep my life and the more noise I can fill it with, the less I have to think. Because it's fear for me. I'm afraid of my own thoughts. No matter what silence is to you, I then challenge you to pursue it. All analysis of what silence is aside, it has the powerful ability to be a tool in our lives. And as a Christian, I have found it so beneficial to just find a time and a place every day to just sit and exist in silence. And not gonna lie, you feel a little bit drained, whether of energy or of stress, but the beauty of it is then you can be filled again with the fulfillment of our Lord. Because the world is a noisy place and it's not getting any quieter. But it is so easy to let that sound, to let the noise of the world drown out the very voice of our Father. Sitting in silence with God is that situation that requires nothing from us, in which all of our anxieties and our worries can be laid at His feet. Think about that example of solitary confinement and ask, would it have been different if that person was a Christian? In which silence does not represent any sort of awkwardness or anxiety, but instead represents that closeness with our God. At the end of the day, silence is kind of a weird concept. I don't think we think about that much. It's just kind of there. But after assessing what role silence plays on the psychological and cultural level, I think we can see how it is a powerful tool in teaching us about ourselves and how we communicate. A couple of months ago, I took a trip up to Olympic National Park to visit that square of silence. And the entire trip up, I laughed with my friend and made jokes, but then we reached that square and I stepped up onto that log and it was pure and unfiltered silence. And it was then that I became so aware of my own existence. Thank you.